is that there are no subtitles on the film you're seeing. You're seeing the original film. There's the audio project at the Poetry Center has never had the funds to have a copy made of the original film, so the titles can only be put on a copy, and we're seeing the original film. That means that when Zukofsky says a name, like the name of Robert Duncan, which he does at one point, one of the better names, as a matter of fact. We hope he says it distinctly, but on the other hand, you may be wondering whether he's talking about something and you missed it. Or you may hear the wrong name, and I would not want that. So I want to point out to you, especially in that one point, note when he says something about Robert Duncan, that he has not made some complimentary remark about Jack Spicer, and he has not called your attention to any of the other nefarious competitors of Robert Duncan that are current. I will explain that entry and fulsomely when it arrives. But let me tell you some of the names that you will find that he mentions and sketched on the line. We also realize that we must explain to you that Zukofsky, although it would be evident very soon, is a poet. For those of you who need to place him, don't know ahead of time. Those of you who know ahead of time will scalp me later for the remarks I will make. But in my own perspective, as beginning to read, coming to age politically, intellectually, and in every other way, in 1936 and 1937, what I found there right after Pound and Stein and Joyce was I certainly had a lead from Ezra Pound that I was going to look in that direction. As I began to look around about what is that man possibly reading, I found Louis Zukofsky. So the one reference in this film to Robert Duncan is that I was a very early reader and I stayed by him. What is significant is that though Zukofsky was read by his contemporaries, and I think the youngest contemporary is George Oppen, if we sketch the contemporaries, and read all the way through, what was remarkable is that I was almost 10 years younger than George, and I was reading him in 36 and 37. We were in the middle of the Moscow trials, and I was a rabid anti-Stalinist next door to Hitler. Stalin looked like the worst thing on the site. And I felt very differently about Stalin. He betrayed communism in my mind, and I still consider communism to be the only valiant and valuable vision of how we might live together socially in relation to the questions of property. So I felt that had been betrayed. As far as I was concerned, Hitler may have betrayed my parents' idea of how you'd live, but he betrayed nothing I had any regard for. So certainly Mussolini just looked like a very wicked jerk, but he didn't look any better to anybody in 36 or 37. So I was harder up about finding that this poem, A8, had appeared in New Directions, and it had praises of Stalin in the middle of the Moscow trials, and that was very hard for me to read. It was very hard for me to read Pound in that period, who had the boss, but at least he labeled the boss. I said, could he have gotten the word better? I hate bosses no matter where they appear. And here, the boss of literature, of course, he's going to admire the boss of a state, and the two are probably just as successful at the end. Okay, so by the time when I wrote to Ezra Pound in 1947, I decided, gee, well, I can come off it. If I can write to Ezra Pound, I guess I could write to Zukofsky, whom I've been reading for years. And as a matter of fact, by 1947, the whole question of Stalinism looked different for me. They were no longer in top. I could see very quickly they were going to be in the bottom. That's where, as a matter of fact, welcome home. I mean, that's where I always thought I was. So when they were in the bottom, they were no longer running around in the WPA, and they were no longer the right guys. They were the wrong guys. And I look around, and I see my pals. They must have joined me. I'm still where it was. So I wrote to Zukofsky, but I was writing to a poet to me who was in command of the possibilities of composing with a poem. That's just to give you an idea of how, at least to someone merely 60 today, this poet looked at the time this film was made in 66. And if I wanted another little tone of credit, how come Zukofsky came into the line of this film Well, Richard, I was the first film they made in this series in 1965, just after our poetry conference here at Berkeley, and they said, who should they film? And I said, well, you've got to get Reznikov. You've got to, and they didn't. They failed to get Reznikov then, and they failed to get him again. I said, he's a marvelous person. I've only seen him once, but you've got to get him on film, and you've got to get Zukofsky. I knew where you've got to put the film. Instead, and you've got to get Spicer. I said, they chickened out on it. They could have filmed him in situ and so forth, and then they decided that the poetry was too doubtful. It was a homosexual circle. He was an alcoholic. He was an undesirable character. I don't know if you've observed on NET or our KPFA, but they'll show a homosexual if it's an absolutely gone drag queen. But they will not show anything resembling a human being in that shape. But still, it's like the old age when the darky is fine if he comes on shuffling and doing a soft shoe act. But if he really looks like he's an actual person, you don't show him. And so far, they take great praise when they show the life of a drag queen, because that's what every homosexual is supposed to be. Well, they were not going to film Spicer, so they lost something. But they did get Zukofsky. And the outtakes on Zukofsky you're going to see this evening all could have been in that original film if they hadn't also had another thing our television has. They're not going to do more than half an hour. They're not going to show 5 minutes more. They're not going to show 10 minutes more. Even if you had absolutely terrific, they'd have missed the crucifixion because it took longer than the regular program, and it didn't allow for the commercials in between. But this is not a crucifixion. Okay. All right, now let me just go to what you hear. You hear early in Zukofsky's talk that he speaks of having written Thee. Thee was written in 1926 when Zukofsky was 22. He was born in 1904. And Thee is the first poem of Zukofsky's I found. It was in Ezra Pound's active anthology, and it led me on to look up the objectivist anthology, and it led me on to recognize what was in my hands when... Oh, and also, New Directions 1936 was out in 1936 and 37, and so Mantis was among the first things that I read. But Thee was written by a very young man, and at 17 I was a very young man, and so a 22-year-old's poem was thoroughly understandable to me. And Zukofsky was just the age of my oldest cousins, who I grew up during the Jazz Age, and they were doing the Charleston during that same period, and I understood everything that was going on in Thee. It's actually a very jazzy out-front poem, about the level my cousins were living. When I look at that poem, I wonder, gee, you could have written this poem and never have been any more than my cousins turned out to be. I mean, you could have written Thee and not actually gone on to any thing in particular. And so what's remarkable in Zukofsky is he builds Thee in. He mentions it no matter where he is, and he goes from Thee to A and builds a whole structure on these two words. Now, so when he talks about Thee, that's that poem. He then relates himself. He's asked, what writers did you draw? What writers are you interested in? Something much more. We're 1966. And he's still got his mind with Pound and Joyce. He wants to tell us it's Pound and Joyce he drew on. And then he mentions Tristan Tzara. Tristan Tzara would be, it is the crossover in which you've got an artist of a very definite kind that would have interested Zukofsky. But it duplicates also because Tristan Tzara is in the left movement in France. And Tristan Tzara gives Zukofsky the other leap, that is, of being related to a part of the French foreign scene. Of that, the fact that he isn't just American. It leaps back. He's first-generation American from Europe, and then it goes back to America. It gives him European roots again. We now know what roots mean. He immediately claims European roots. But he claims something else. In the film, you'll find him saying and talking at some length that he was born in 1904 when Henry James came back to Manhattan. You find he's produced a ghost father. Where in the world is poor old Zukofsky, because the senior? Because actually the father of the poet we're looking at proves to be Henry James, and just as Olson gives himself a straight line into American literature through Melville, Zukofsky gives himself and built through all his early years built solidly his claim to being a continuation of Henry Adams and Henry James. Somewhat alarming news for the two gentlemen if they were to arrive to even look at the poems that had their descent, and very puzzling as the early Zukofsky writes essays on Henry Adams and tries to build in that, so we're told that American picture. But in this film, I want to underline something you'll hear him say because it leaped out to me. We come at the end, and he's reading, because it's contemporaneous with this film, by the way. It's the poem he's writing at the time. He's reading part 64 of his Catullus. And he talks, the puns, he says, are my own private business. And then he says something about the shape he's working on, what's going on in that poem. And the language in that poem, I would call attention to it that Zukofsky, who had just worked for some years with Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's were verse, which is a great, in the period I grew up in poetry, this was really prohibited. Shakespeare was viewed as fustian, as rhetoric, as just sounding great. But Zukofsky is really attuned with the way Shakespeare's mind moves. That's what drew him to write Bottom on Shakespeare. And when you see him on Catullus, it sounds very much like we suddenly see that our period actually has a real Shakespearean movement in thought language, exactly the way his mind's moving. And then at the end he says, so that this will become American. I wrote this, strange as he sounds, I wrote it so that this will become American. So I would say through the whole thing in Zukofsky, the most moving thing, and these outtakes, it's not in the tape. The film they took is marvelous. I wish we could get the two together. But this outtake contains one line that's such a key to the entire inner drama of Zukofsky. I will be so much Zukofsky, and I will say that the most significant thing is that Henry James is my ghost father, but the most important thing is that the most preposterous thing about me will become American. The most foreign thing about me will become American. No one will get to come into American literature without struggling and having to take this to become American. And believe me, I think you will find the people who have real troubles with Zukofsky have only to think about the contrast between Sandburg, who made it availably American, and nothing was becoming American when Sandburg wrote it that way. It was American, man. Was is another tense. But to become American, that your speech, preposterous, out of the world, unbelievable, not like anybody ever talked before, and so literary, by the way. We've caught probably the most literary poet outside of Charles Olson. Now, I hope the whole audience doesn't shoot me, but both are poets of books, not like Williams of listening on the street. You never hear the language on the street. In Zukofsky, you hear the language of books. It goes from Henry James to Shakespeare to this will become American. Henry James may have gone to England, written something that was going to become English. Henry James was an American who made this is going to become English, and he destroyed all of English literature. Because it never could become Henry James, who was so American. Okay. You hear him mention James. Okay. Now, after Zara, he has another play that I want you to, that I'll simply recite. He has a lovely play of puns, and he himself discusses puns in this. It's important for him to get across how much his mind moves this way. He says, of classic and romantic, it doesn't signify. He's both. Classic is class, and romantic is roaming. I mean, you can do anything around there. Once you move them around and let them move this way, it becomes silly. But the 30s had a hard line. You were romantic if you wrote in a certain way, and they wanted to be classic. That was possibly Eliot telling us that he was going to be not any further out than Dryden, and this was pretty classic, man. And Zukofsky has that whole thing in control. He's not bothered about whether people lower those terms on him. That's important to see when it comes up. He speaks of Basil Bunting then. He speaks of an old friendship of how a person you have not seen for years remains your friend. A person you see only once a month or so is your friend. Your friends are of a different order. I cannot see this film without wanting to relay to all of you, when you watch it, a very moving drama of, as far as I know, it's true of me and it's true of most poets I've ever seen. If you feel intensely, you can feel wrong intensely, and it's a very tough thing, and indeed, to stay by enduring feelings when you are very quickly and have been trained very quickly to move to an immediate volatile emotional reaction. Now, he's speaking of bunting, and he sees it as an enduring relationship. He has not seen bunting for years. When he does see bunting, he will see bunting at a time when Zukofsky had just refused to read at the University of Texas for $500 because he felt that it was not an honorary fee. It's all expenses and $500. I'm still running out there of grabbing all expenses and $200. So I have a little different feeling. I'm thinking of the cash, but he had not been honored, by the way, for years. Neither had bunting. So he needs and he knew $500 isn't going to stand for the fact that for some solid 15 years he wrote with a few lone readers who honored it all, and a great deal of dishonor. Okay, so Texas turns around and asks Bunting, and Bunting accepts. He sees the $500. In some odd way, he doesn't need the honor or worry about whether that's honorable. He can see the $500 and that you can get it with all expenses paid, so he says yes. So when Bunting, on the way to that Texas thing, calls on Zukofsky, Zukofsky is immediately sure that Bunting has been offered more than he was offered, and that he has been dishonored and Bunting has been honored, and the friendship that means so much to him, you can't miss it when he speaks of this, is blown up immediately. This is not lonely. I'll tell you one more story out of court about Zukofsky. I got a letter from him, and he said, "I am worried about you. Now, this is pure projection. And yet I have been more than guilty of it at times. I'm worried about you. You risk friendships on your temper. You must remember never to." At the time that letter arrived, I wondered, where is it coming from? It was written in the very period when this scene had a scene that separated two men totally. There was no way Bunting could ever return to that place. Now, the next impulse is to write to the next youngest one and say, "You," knowing that it's of the breed of the poet. And my explanation of this, by the way, is not just that we're bad-tempered, but we are really trained to move with tremendous feeling on the least hints, and how to manage our human lives needs an enormous keel. So you'll see that the keel of the household is the one that keeps the perspective that Zukofsky has. Following Bunting, he then begins to refer to but not mention Pound. You must realize that, and that would be true for me too at a certain point, when you're talking about he or the poet or something, very much as you talk about the philosopher, and it meant Aristotle for 1,000 years. There was no other one you meant by the philosopher. You didn't mean Plato. The poet meant Pound for the ones close to it. By the time I'm writing the cantos, I was writing the cantos. By the time I'm writing the passages, the poet is Olson. It's very clear. I simply speak of him as the poet. That was where I was in my universe and still is. He's the poet in the sense that Aristotle was the philosopher. And so he doesn't mention, I don't know if something's cut out there, because remember, we've got the outtake. But it makes sense that he wouldn't even have to mention the name. Later he does talk about Pound when he's talking about his own qualities. Following that, he talks of Spinoza. That's another name. You will hear all the names here. Then he runs through a series of puns that delight him. He talks about sight, seeing, and then he says it soon becomes sight, citing a text. And then he leaves deliciously up in the air the one we hear right away, the sight of where we are. On this site, and so forth. And following, almost as if it were, and again I see the way in which, in the movement of mind or talk, the rhyme so carries through, we find him referring to Eric Satie. And then he speaks, and now, where he had said that Henry James came to Manhattan, the significant thing is that Henry James was in Manhattan in other words, the father was in Manhattan when Louis Zukofsky was born. Louis Zukofsky now re-relates the whole thing to the American scene because for the first time Paul Zukofsky, as a violinist, had recorded his first recording of the Ives sonatas. So he is talking then, see him talking about his son had recorded the Ives sonatas. Now his son had recorded quite a number of other things. I find it highly significant that he takes an American composer at that time viewed, Mrs. H.H.A. Beach, it's her choice, Amy Beach, is a composer of the same order of Ives, that is, as far as the quality of the music goes. She's not of the same order in the sense of being an innovator or a loner, and certainly she has no macho, which Ives displays everywhere. But as far as Zukofsky at this point of reference, he doesn't know of an Amy Beach. What he knows is his son has done a classic recording of the American counterpart in music. That means, again, 3 generations of Zukofskys, the first Henry James Zukofsky, the second Zukofsky, the Hasids have begun to disappear, and the third one is Paul Zukofsky, who we almost feel has discovered Ives. And by the second recording, well, actually, I think, and my own feeling is that Paul Zukofsky arrives at a real recording of the Ives, and we have a classic recording of Ives. So we've really fulfilled a father-son, son-father thing that is built in that reaffirms the American. Then he talks about Whitman, and he then refers to Whitman as our book of odes. What he means there is that Pound had affirmed we needed a book of odes like Confucius, and that our book of odes lay in Leaves of Grass. Now, actually, this is a larger, much larger affirmation than the Henry James one. And it's one that Zukofsky reiterates, and it's one that he tried to take an oath he would stay by, respondes he gives. He gives the most eloquent testimony that it is the most completely available and moving language of Whitman he stands by. Meanwhile, he's moving out into a language which is so difficult. I will try to read one of these last poems myself at the end. That's what I'm going to do. What I will do at the end as far as reading goes is try to read one of the flowers. And we're very far from the thing that Zukofsky was saying with our Book of Odes. Our Book of Odes, however, is really central to him, reaffirmed at the point of his essays, reaffirmed at the time of this movie in '66. Then he talks about Giotto. I heard Giotto. He talks about Picasso, and he's talking about Picasso's statue in which the man with the sheep is put together from different elements, and this is the counterpart of the way Zukofsky overhears possible messages in the poem. And then he starts talking about the Catullus and about a poem of Catullus that has to do with Peleus and Thetis. Those are names that come in, but they are not back in that discussion. I think that runs through what I wanted to be sure you heard as you're listening to it. The line on the puns is, "My puns are my private business." The one I find again, and I will end with then and turn you back to the film, "so that this will become American." The first part of the Spirit Romance and publishing the novelette, that was because we talked at the time we're seeing the films, and I didn't write it down on a piece of paper. We've got the 2 publishers here of 2 publications, a pun that just arrived fortuitously, and the we was how intensely that whole scene felt itself. I mean, these were what Pound very much wanted to see in print, to see a fundamental book of Williams and a fundamental book of his own. And it was the generation of George and Mary Oppen and of Zukofsky that were determined to see that they get into print and get into print entirely in community, and those so that those volumes I acquired my copies of those volumes during the war years in New York in 40 or 41 or 42 when they could still be found. They are not greatly durable. I wouldn't call mine mint copies because if you're unfortunately don't get it to resell it and you hitchhike all over the place with copies of 2 books, I think you can go farther with a Tauchnitz edition and have it survive. Then I'd hate to think that I, in some fit of whatever, rendered the copies of Novelette and of that were rather spiffy when I got them, as a matter of fact, and they were unread when I got them. I mean, I hate to say that, but they were sitting there. They had been for some years in a bookstore. No, they were really they were reading copies. They said they were reading copies out front. So that was that note. That we really have present the two who saw to the physical part of realizing that whole publishing venture here in the Oppen. At the end, he is reading aloud a passage of Gibbon, and I don't know if it was his inspiration that go with, but it certainly could have been the feeling of the filming of the film and the long walk, because as he reads that Gibbons, I certainly found remarkable how his very characteristic walk. You could follow it forever, and even the way that hat was permanent installation next door to Marion Moore's. You could identify 2 of them by the hat they read, wrote, and so forth. But the way he walked along the street and the way he read the passage of Gibbons, the rhythms in the passage, and it tells a lot about the way that a very long period of us, running from the 20s on through to even the present day, build in blocks of prose and other things because we detect in them our rhythm. And when they're read in our rhythm, we find that our rhythm goes back in the human community of Gibbons. It goes back to other minds. We're sure to find our way of reading it. Not to misread it, but it will show the way we walk. Okay, that's the end remarks on that.
As you know, as you noticed, there were no titles on that film, and I would like to tell you who is responsible for it. The original production of the material in the film was from the series USA Poetry, and the producers were Bryce Howard, executive producer, Dick Moore, producer, Irving Saraf and Phil Green, camera and editing. In the Poetry Center project, that is to say the creation of this outtake film, the principal people involved were Kathy Fraser, who was then director, Thomas Parkinson, who I think recommended that the material be given to the Poetry Center, and Len Randolph at the NEA. In the production of this outtake film, Gordon Craig was the executive producer, Peter Coons was the editor, Diane Williams, production assistant, and Steve Bassett did video production. Okay, we'll move an opaque projector out now, and then Barrett Watten will take over as well.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's upside down. Okay, you can hold on that for a second. Well, I don't. Yeah, that Gibbon quote actually is part of the text of A15. You didn't really actually say that, but it's not a straight quote. It's it's edited and it jumps quite a lot actually. So I have been reading Zukofsky for 10 years, and that's 30 years less than Duncan's been reading it. And that puts me in a different position. And what I saw initially in Zukofsky that was of interest was the hardness and unyieldingness of the thought, and especially the line, the absolute discrete movement from line to line in his lyrics. And at the time, I think that was like connected with a desire for something that could not be misread. In other words, that the demands of the text or of the poetry would be such that you couldn't take it for something other than what it was. And I also used to think that about Pound, but now I don't anymore. And so I'm still interested in that, but at this point also, and in what I'm going to do now, I'm interested in generating vocabulary from Zukofsky's texts, specifically towards what you can do with it in writing or in other kinds of art, in other media also. As far as criticism, I think that the film is actually very good. And it seems to me to do two things. The first is, holds the camera on Zukofsky while he reads. And this has a quality that does throw light onto his thinking processes and his ear and his voice. And the second thing it does is to separate his voice and a text from the visual image, which is the last section. And the first time I saw that, I was completely struck by the seeming comment that the visual, the visual content seemed to come right out of the text, and it seemed like, in fact, there was a sort of a grand historical vision that was being focused in walking around on the New York City streets, and that would be very true to Zukofsky's poetics also. So that's something that say criticism could do, would be to make an unnatural division in the way that in the work itself, given the work. And so that's what I want to do now, is sort of split Zukofsky in one way down the middle. And Zukofsky is very explicit about the difference between knowing a thing and talking about it. And in his terms, it's a monstrosity, really, to speak about something you can just as easily read or see. And I even have a quote, actually, that says that. So in some sense, like, talking about is going to be a deformation. So one of the things to do in that case is just to do what Zukofsky would seem to want you to do, which is to look at the work, or to read it, or to actually look at it as something, as a thing in itself. So this bit with the opaque projector, I don't really want to be taken as a teaching device, because I don't feel like I'm doing that. I would rather like this to look like the way I am in relation to Zukofsky. And so, okay, I want to separate two poles in Zukofsky's work, and one is found objects, and the other is translation. And Zukofsky published a book in 1962 called Found Objects. The dates were Found Objects, and then there was a subtitle, 1926 to 1962. And so these were poems from, up to that point, his entire career, and with the kind of a pun of the inversion of the 26 to 62 being characteristic of the fact that they're having been found. And I think there's 16 poems in there. There may be a few more. I don't have that right, I don't think. But their works, which Zukofsky said to him, now seem to have come out of a place like something you would have found or picked up, and then made into a work just as such. And now I think the concept there would be somewhat different than a ready-made, and it would be somewhat different than I don't know, there was a kind of a vogue for found objects, I think, in the 60s, but I don't know anyway. And the other pole in this take is translation, or how do you deal with received information, other languages, bodies of work removed from the language of the speaker at a particular time and place, like American English, New York, in the 60s. And Zukofsky does talk about trying to get the sound of poetry from other times or other languages, how to do that. And he qualifies it as transliteration. And I think that that's a somewhat ironic qualification, actually, because it seems to fit fairly specifically into his sense of how you deal with a statement that's coming out of a situation which you cannot physically reach. How do you know something that you can't see? So I think that his qualification of, say, the Catullus translation as transliteration is somewhat of a, it's to sort of throw or toss out the possible, talking about what he's doing in that work, and to try to get you to just hear it, which in finally is what he wants, and that's what he insists on, and that's not what I'm doing. So that's one of the monstrosities. Zukofsky, one of the things he said, the words are my life, and I always thought that was like an incredibly difficult thing for me to understand. How are the words your life? Your life is one thing, your words are another. But he says that, so in a way, I think that question is what I keep coming back to, and then there'll be ways that I'll see that as possible in Zukofsky's work, like that. Oh, he's right. His words really are his life at this point. That does tend to make it difficult to talk about, and Hugh Kenner in an essay on A1 through 12 says something that struck me as being true, which was that in Zukofsky actually specifically in the poem A, there are no structural myths. And I think by structural myths, Kenner was thinking something like, for instance, in the first canto, going down to the world of the dead as calling up history. That being the first poem in the epic poem would be a structural myth. He's more specific about that, but I think that there's a sense of like the order of the poem is in its structure and argument somewhat separate from the contents. All right. And once I was talking to Clark Coolidge, the poet, and was sort of, well, how could you describe the structure of A? And he said, well, it's like you could start anywhere, and that would define any other place to go in the poem. And I think more than any other poet that I'm aware of, that's true. That any point in Zukofsky's work is a place for an argument, and that goes to any other. You can start anywhere in Zukofsky, and you will get an argument that will eventually end up being his entire body of work. And he's completely he sticks to this with absolute rigor from his earliest, or the works that we have of his that are the earliest published works up to his last works. There's a quote by Zukofsky in Bottom on Shakespeare, the work in which he does away with epistemology by interweaving text of Shakespeare and philosophy in his own writing. And he quotes from Midsummer Night's Dream. It shall be called Bottom's Dream because it has no bottom. So as far as talking about it, then you want to start somewhere. You want to specify one variable. Okay, now I'm going to let the text lead me into this. This first bit is from A6, and it's fairly well quoted or much quoted statement of Zukofsky's Poetics at that time. But when we push up the daisies, the melody, the rest is accessory. My one voice, my other is an objective, rays of the object brought to a focus. An objective, nature is creator, desire for what is objectively perfect, inextricably the direction of historic and contemporary particulars. The first line, but when we push up the daisies, is a concern throughout Zukofsky's work, which is, how are you read when you're dead? You know, what happens to the language that you, or the text that you realize out of the language of your time after you are not there physically anymore? And this leads inevitably to an argument or an interest in how does one deal with the language and realization of writers who are no longer physically present. That is, how do you deal with moments in history in literature? So what we have left is the melody, the rest is accessory. Now there are two definitions of an objective in this, and one is that of a lens and focusing, and the other is of something pointed at. And you would say that he's trying to do both. And
which is the something pointed at?
Well, an objective.
Oh, I know what you said. One.
Which one?
It seems to be nature as creator, or what? I'm puzzled.
My other is an objective, rays of the object brought to a focus.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Well. Okay. In the essay that precedes the 1931 issue of poetry, which was the objectivist issue, Zukofsky puts a dictionary definition where there are both of those terms.
No,
but in this one, which one is which? Right.
This one he says nature as creator. Doesn't seem to me to indicate
something that's pointed at. Yeah.
But I don't pointed out nature as creator. Creator is a very tough term to use in there in any sense of focus or pointing.
Inextricably the direction of historic and contemporary particulars. I mean, there is something being pointed at, yeah. You know, there's some.
Yeah, but what do we do with it? What do we do with creator in there? Do we throw it out?
No.
Okay. Some often much heavier than, I mean, just as heavy as bringing something to focus. Nature, gee, that's a straight romantic thing with nature as creator.
No, it's actually from Spinoza, who distinguishes between nature as creator and nature as created.
Mm-hmm. But
and it's merely medieval. It's a medieval distinction.
Yeah, but this is in '86, so it's not merely Spinoza. He could have taken a lot of stuff.
Okay. For example, if you were to have a theme such as Zukofsky uses in Bottom on Shakespeare, being the argument of Zukofsky's work and taking Shakespeare's work as a whole, which argues itself, the act of the text of Bottom on Shakespeare is recognizing Shakespeare itself as nature, as creator of Zukofsky's thinking in that work. And that would be an example of that comes to mind. Excuse me? Okay, I see several ways of reading objective, and one thing I want to say is that this is a definition of poetics. At the same time, there are many ambiguities in it, and that in fact it does tend, like any statement that Zukofsky would make about what he's doing, to self-destruct, to consume itself. Can we have the next one? I wanted to say something about the technique of putting A together. And one cue, or one solid line in A is its relationship to film technique. And I think I don't know where I read it, there's a letter that Zukofsky wrote, I forget to whom, saying that after seeing, I think either an Eisenstein or Pudovkin movie, that he had understood what he could do. So there was a recognition on his part that film technique was useful in construction. And this is just one quote from A8, which I think shows a fairly kind of gross montage. 1871, Henry Adams, my book is out. My own share in the volume, less than half. And few works except, that should be possibly some few of Aristotle and Bacon contain anything to compare with the wisdom of this. Vain to expect proper appreciation in this world, and I have my doubts whether I shall fare much better in any other. You will support my indifference to vulgar opinion. As one cannot doubt foreign press dispatches unless he wants to be expelled from the list of civilized people, believe them and don't disturb me in the other world. J. Stalin. Okay, now there's an identification going on here, I think, with Zukofsky as a writer to both of these texts. And on the one hand, there's Henry Adams, a self in sort of, or whatever was going on at the time to isolate him. Okay, here's the next. Okay, this is another example of technique that I wanted to point to. This is the first 8 lines of A7. And the scene that you get, basically, although there are other things coming into it, is Zukofsky, or the poet, sitting on the stoop, looking at sawhorses with red lamps hanging from the ends and likening them to...
Speak into the mic, the punk rockers are drowning you out.
Oh, you can't hear it? Okay. I thought you could, hear pretty well in this. But how can I speak into the mic and look? Well, maybe move the mic.
Well, the mic, in any case, the mic just records and there's no...
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Why don't you come down if you can't hear me, actually, okay? Horses, who will do it? Out of manes. Words will do it, out of manes, out of airs, but they have no manes, so there are no airs. Birds of words, for me to them no singing gut. For they have no eyes, for their legs are wood, for their stomachs are logs with print on them. Blood red, red lamps hang from necks, or where could be necks. 2 legs stand A, 4 together M. Okay, there's a pun of manes to names. And, how are we going to build this thing? Out of names or out of manes, which is like a likeness to this figure of the sawhorse, which is also being likened to a horse. Words will do it out of manes, out of airs, but they have no manes. Okay, so there's like a buildup of, or a piling up, almost like of notes that poet would make of like all of different ways that you could get from a sawhorse to imaginary construct being poem. And there's just a weaving in and out of different ways of approaching the simple fact. And in a way, this does recognize the fact to be there in spite of that difficulty, so that I would say that what's being insisted on here is, given the fact that you have the sawhorses and the situation of the poet writing, all you can do is approximate in figurative language. So can I have the next one? Okay, well, could you actually get that to? Okay, this is the first stanza and the last 5-line stanza of the first half of A9, which Zukofsky read part of. He read part of the first, I think, part of the first stanza, and then this last 5-line bit. And A9 is like a transliteration or a translation of Cavalcanti's Canzoni, and it uses for vocabulary the everyman edition of capital, so that there's a fixed set of terms. And as Robert Duncan said, this may seem like to us now like other direction, like using a text almost in somewhat arbitrary manner. But at the time, this vocabulary was like common experience to everyone. So that there would really be a frame of reference that would be being dealt with by the act of this writing as well as like an operation on a text, right? Like everybody knows these terms and uses them or misuses them constantly. Okay, an impulse to action sings of a semblance of things related as equated values. The measure all use is time congealed labor, in which abstraction things keep no resemblance to goods created. Integrated all hues hide their natural use to one and one's neighbor, so that were the things words, they could say, light is, like night is, like us, when we meet our mentors. Use hardly enters into their exchanges. Bought to be sold things our value arranges. We flee people who made us as a right is, whose sight is quick to choose us as frequenters, but see our centers do not show the changes of human labor our value estranges. Okay, this seems to me to be an extension of technique of A7, where you've got the bits and pieces of talking about something out there being brought together woven together in a poetic form. One of the things that Zukofsky said about this text is that there's a ratio of the N's and R's, or Kenner points this out also. It's a ratio of the N's and R's as in a formula for a conic section. So I've done a planar version of a conic section down there. Now, basically, the conic section would be when you've got a cone, you pass a plane through any part of the cone, not where the 2 points of the cone touch, and you've got a curve being the curve as opposed to the two lines being a plane cut through the cone. And as you get out towards infinity, the curve of the conic section approaches the ratio of the 2 lines. And so this is something that the text is attempting, which is by approximation of relationship to form a ratio among words themselves, and taking say notes from the technique of A7 and making the words interact with themselves to define themselves. And the last 5 lines, we are things, say, like a quantum of action, defined product of energy and time, now in these words which rhyme, now how song's exaction forces abstraction to turn from equated values to labor we have approximated. So there's the sense that there's, like I see a completely clear problem. What do you do with description and event? How do you make the language of analysis become event? And that's obviously what Marxism is about, is how do you make an analysis become an event? So that the question as to what these words actually mean must have been, for anybody seriously thinking when Marxism was an actual, or more of a social fact than it is now, although, not to diminish its, not in the United States anyway. I mean, the situation was different in the 30s. You've got to figure out what the words mean, and this seems to be what that's about. How do you make them mean something? Okay, why don't we go to the next? Okay, now we want a little of the bottom. Okay, now I mentioned the problem of translation being, what do you do with, with another... Yeah. This is very crude mechanical access. That looks pretty good. Okay, this is one short section of Zukofsky's translation of Catullus, along with the Latin original and a more literal translation by Horace Gregory. And I was saying that translation is one of the poles in my interest here. And how do you deal with a language other than available to the specific language in a specific time of the writer? And I wrote something about this work actually 5 years ago, and I thought I would just read part of it because it'll summarize what I think is going on in the work better than I could say it. First, that the sounds and rhythms in English come as close as possible to those of the Latin. So that's like that involves a mathematical limit there, a ratio. The English is all of Zukofsky's experience of it through reading, speech, radio, etc. Second, syntax, diction, mode of statement are a function of the sound. The syntax and meaning become increasingly elaborate and difficult as the words sound and move like the Latin. Careful attention, with the help of a literal translation, brings the thread of the original meaning into focus within the twist of the, quote, new English. One sees Catullus through an intermediate which is a constant, or one that approaches an ideal in the course of the work, and this transformation is of a fixed order. English has its sounds, meaning runs through them. Knowing English, and once learning to see the sense through the sound torque, one can see Catullus through the English words. There's such pleasure in the language, but that's not the point to make. I felt a presence behind what the difficult English was making me do. By holding one thing constant, Zukofsky makes direct perception possible, or intends direct perception. The translation is then of Catullus into English, not into Zukofsky or Horace Gregory and their feelings for who Catullus is. Such method comments directly on Pound's, in which case the constant was the translator and his feeling for the original poem and poet. In Zukofsky, there is not this intuition, rather mastery over a fixed set of procedures. For the other method, see the earlier translation of Carmen 8 and all, which is actually about the person of Catullus and what that's about. Zukofsky takes the original out of historical time and makes the poem again language. pointing to a living other. This seems only possible or clear when the language itself is taken to a limit. So I guess I'll read the Horace Gregory first. Lesbia speaks evil of me with her husband near, and he, damned idiot, loves to hear her. Chuckling, the fool is happy, seeing nothing, understanding nothing. If she, forgetting me, fell silent, her heart would be his alone, content and peaceful. But she raves, spitting hatred upon me, all of which carries this meaning: I am never out of her mind, and what is more, she rises in fury against me with words that make her burn, her blood passionate for me. And then I want Bob Perlman to read the Latin.
Maxima laetia, mule de illustentis, si nostri vita faceret, sa nascet, nunc quod ganida oblivitu, non solo minit, sed quae hoc prior est res, irritas, hoc est volitur et loquitur.
Okay, Lesbia, my price sent to her hero, mauls and deplores me. Dig it, he, the lug, fatuous, maximal light, titillates. Mule, nil will sent this. She knows to obliterate would carry it. Sane is asset, now quite gone with what obloquy there, known solely my minute. So qualms molt her cry, hard to erase, ire how tossed. I guess the hotter wit clacks with her. Okay. Now I can get the first two lines almost precisely if you take my price sent to her hero having something to do with the way the husband, Maximal Light, thinks about Catullus. If you can get from price and sent to a person, mule, that stupid him, I guess, won't be able to sense this. She knows to obliterate would carry it. Sane is asset. Well, that must refer, carry it must refer to sane is asset, which must mean that it would be better for her if she forgot me, but she's not going to. So carry it would refer to that, and that's the kind of thing that, the kind of twisted syntax that Zukofsky gets into. Now quite gone with what obloquy there, that's pretty literal. Known solely mine minute. She knows only what's happening with him, I would guess. So qualms mold her cry hard to erase, so she can't get him out of her mind. Ire how tossed, I can't get it quite, I don't think I could describe how that works, and I guess the hotter wit clacks with her.
I go faster reading the Latin.
Yeah, well, I can't read the Latin. I can't translate it.
Not being able to read the Latin go faster.
Yeah. Yeah. You mean you might get it? You might get a better sense, or what?
Right. I mean, although this is the book that stumped me when I arrived.
Yeah.
I might say a few words about where I was for about 40 years before. We heard Zukofsky in '66 in the middle of this reaffirm that Whitman is our book of odes, and that this is our furnace ground. Whitman describes the poem as the path between the soul and reality, the world that it's in. And there's a great gap at the point of Catullus. Nothing in that household that we saw Zukofsky in the very household which he's translating Catullus. Most people translating Catullus, and I think this probably even held for Horace Gregory, but when you get Rexroth or Jonathan Williams translating Catullus, they're in very much the same shitbox that Catullus was in. Catullus is raunchy. He's also determined to keep keep an arete, a distinction in the middle of all this. And this poem, this very one that we're looking at, is one of the most charged and agonizing poems about yes, it's not erotic. It's about a contained anger and so forth. There's no source for Zukofsky for even tapping what's in the Catullus, and so he's got enough gap that no wonder we look like we're caught in schoolboy Latin translating when the schoolboy doesn't even have a hint about what kind of a life the Catullus is coming from. Catullus is a direct path between the soul and a reality, so strong that Horace Gregory hits it as best he can, that we really see it in Jonathan Williams and Rex Rose and recognize, but no wonder those two are very close to Catullus, the way their heads are. But then distinctively, Zukofsky chooses to go there and play a kind of chamber music because he's going to force us to a pure music. Nothing in him is going to be able to carry the Catullus across. Nothing of him will give any genuine content to those words. So we stumble. I think it means. It must be mean to say. But it can't say it with vigor anywhere because it can't connect with a life emotion.
Right.
And words,
well, I would tend
that when they're rare.
I would tend to disagree with that point of view actually on Catullus. Like that if you look at Carmen 8, which is in anew, I think that Zukofsky actually does identify very well. I mean, he really does get behind the statement that Catullus is making as a person, and he does it. I know, but okay, this Catullus is a philosophical work like Bottom. You know, it's about a language that's coming from another time and place. It's about how you, like you say, how do you make it American? How do you make an American language? And it's a specific act. If you've got, you know, it's like it's Poundian in the sense that, say, Pound wants to get through identification with person, wants to get the spirit of romance into the English language. Okay, Zukofsky is not identifying with person to do that. He's identifying with syntax and possibilities available through the diction of American English, like Guy Davenport says. You've got four sources, you know, Anglo-Saxon, French, Greek, Latin, and new words. Okay, so he's trying to get all of that vocabulary in. He's trying to invent a language using a mathematically derived model. Curve, which is like curve fitting, and I wanted to exemplify that just with the simple addition of two curves, A and B. You've got A plus B. Okay, say A plus B was nature or Catullus, and A and B were, say, two limits that Zukofsky was working within. One, say, being the sound, and the other the availability of English diction. Then you could add those two together and get you know, and approximate the curve. And this is something that's done in computer science. You have a natural event, and then you try to describe it by adding curves together until you can get to that particular you know, that so-called natural curve or that natural graph. So that to me it's very, you know, I think that the mathematical model that Zukofsky had in A9 to assign words their value is actually being used also in this translation, and it doesn't. So it's a completely other method of working than Pound's, which is the other great method of translation.
I'm not asking you this question, but is the mathematical model you're talking about then used metaphorically without assigned values? I mean, is that what you're saying? Is that the model is the metaphor for that?
Well, I don't think
or are
that,
there assigned values that make it more material?
Right. I'm not comfortable with metaphor, but with approximate language. Okay. So that you could say that a mathematical model would be an approximation to nature, just like a metaphor would be an approximation also. Okay? So it's approximate language. And so he's trying to approximate a text through two limits in this work.
I'm very puzzled that the mathematical model itself would not be so much more efficient as such than anything that is possibly arrived at in language, that the language would be extremely wasteful by that time. The model is pure and beautiful, and the language, if that's what the language is doing, is hopelessly lost, mistaken, and absolutely wasteful from word to word.
Yeah, well, it's just like you say.
It's got the whole efficiency.
Say you were how do you say, a Marxist with with ethics, and you're trying to follow the deformations of an analysis, or the permutations of an analysis through a body of work, or say Trotsky would be analyzing all of the statements of the POUM coming out of the Spanish Civil War, and try to deal with that, what he sees wrong with their analysis at that particular time. This would be what I'm trying to do. I think that Zukofsky identifies. I'm not saying that that's how to read Zukofsky. I'm saying that you can do that, and that Zukofsky thinks like that. Part of his language comes out of that reconciliation of Marxism to natural event. What does it really mean, right? So that you want to follow the ways that his early cues, if he's insisting to make his work one, over the course of his life, how is he going to deal with all of this approximation? How is he going to deal with, the Marxism of A8 and the family unit in A12, which seems to be, a denial of his earlier social involvement. So I'm trying to follow, his structuring devices, and in a way, it is like a monstrosity. It is not hearing; it's an imposition on his text. But be that as it may, Okay.
I just want to read this passage about horses to show how much fun it was to read. It was also fun to read. I think we're not far off of when you saw us in this tangle, because my mind, you can hear me yelping at where my mind is frequently when we come to the possibilities that are suggested that we've got a very large puzzle and that we've just got language. Because in the first place, I in no way believe that there is such a thing as just language any more than there is just footprints. I mean, it is human life that prints itself everywhere in it, and that's what we read when we're really reading. I mean, we're very good detectives of it, of the traces that are left in everything, including language. But I just want to close with reading this Horses because it's great fun. The poem is called A, and what he saw right away, he could have seen it the minute A became right up there. A parallels thee, and then one of the earliest things he could have seen if he walked on the street any day was a sawhorse, and he would have seen A at the end of the sawhorse. And he proposes at the end of this little passage that if the two sawhorses are together, you see an M, and his manes is running in between that as it goes. But the horses in there then become another area we did not talk about Zukofsky, and that is how much he's like Lewis Carroll. That includes his liking to have puzzles and freaky things like happen in Alice. And he himself calls attention to this matter of Lewis Carroll in his own quotes. He says in one passage, he attributes the quote to Lewis Carroll. I've madly gone through Lewis Carroll trying to find it. It probably is buried in there. And that is, sometimes the muse has something to say, and sometimes the muse has to say something. Now, when she has to say something, almost anything can go on, because she's going to try to make it likely, but she's got to say something, so she'll fill it in. And sometimes she has something to say. And when you heard me screaming at this point about this passage in the Catullus, even in Zukofsky's hands, it has something to say. We're not at the place where we're just talking about a play there. It's a very grievous human experience. It's in a lesbian. It's not. The Catullus itself is not about just language. It's about such a solid experience. It's lasted for several thousand years. And so it's not word play. When you take the word play from it, it's got to relate in order to even come to the same level in it. Joyce relates very much because Joyce is deep in his psyche and everything's charged through. And so when he's in Macbeth and so forth, he's at the same level Macbeth is at. So that his double plays become thunderous in their resonances. Now, it's in the playful that we get that sometimes the muse has to say something, and then you play with it. Then you sound it as music. I'd have no trouble with the Catullus when Zook is reading it and sounding it as music. It's lovely. It's when I turn to the page and ask, what has he done to Catullus? And then I find he hasn't done anything very important at all with Catullus. Nothing at all with Catullus. He's drawing from Catullus as trivially as Picasso draws from Velasquez. You only have to compare the triviality with which Picasso approaches Velasquez with those monumental places where Van Gogh draws from Millet, or where Rubens paints from Titian, to see the difference of the triviality of our period, violent triviality. Okay, but there's no complaint about this. It's a lovely play once you spot this horses and have this swing of this Lewis Carroll-like passage in which the sawhorses and horses are interchanged. Pure Oz. Anybody who grew up with Zook didn't grow up with, I don't think, with this 1900 Oz book. 1901, I guess it is, before you have the sawhorse in there, a live sawhorse. Horses. Who will do it? Out of manes. Words will do it. Out of manes, out of airs, but they have no manes, so there are no airs. Birds of words, from me to them no singing gut. For they have no eyes, for their legs are wood, for their stomachs are logs with print on them. Blood red lamps hang from necks, or where could be necks? 2 legs stand A, 4 together M. Very solid actual image there of the actual sawhorses. Their legs are wood. They have no eyes. The whole series of a childlike play. Now, I'm not going to make comments because we read. Yeah.
Do you mind if I just finish what I started off to do so that I can just?
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. No.
Go ahead, because I really did. What? Yeah.
I just wanted to get some sense of fun in this.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, this is my sense of fun, and I like to do this. I like to think like this. I like to think like this about Zukofsky. Okay, I realize that it's impossible for me to sort of finish with the entire argument that I sort of set out to do. I think you can see like the kind of take I'm getting. So it really does seem to be, in a sense, it would be redundant to run through it. What this isn't this for magazine I edit. Okay, just to try to, I will try to read these 2 quotes from Bottom, and that will be all I'll do. Bottom on Shakespeare is a work that Zukofsky wrote using all of Shakespeare's work as a text. And with the theme that the clear physical eye is better than the erring brain is a recurrent and determining idea in Shakespeare's works. And I didn't really want to deal with that, but I wanted to deal with the way the statements were made. And I think of these. I'm just going to read the first. Nevertheless, though unalterable in itself, thought does not preclude the perishability of particular senses when it conjoins their thermodynamic mobile reflections to an assemblage of all possible places, where those who sense and reflect with respect to these places and immobile thought are conceived by it as forever acting, maybe walking, and so assured by it the word assemblage must remind them that sometimes they must stop. For the case is, then there's a quote, but the paraphrase is difficult. Now that's a kind of I'm using him because I'm not telling you exactly what he's talking about. But there is a sense of like, as in the technique of A9, of trying to get the words to evaluate themselves by causing them to interact with themselves. I think that you can see pretty clearly in that quote. Okay, and then do you want to do the next? Carla? I think I'll stop there, actually. I'm not going to go any farther. That's what I want to say. That on the one hand, you have a value system set up which ends in, for Zukofsky, in the clear physical eye, seeing things as they are. It's a moral value. To me, this moral value is not useful as an end product to Zukofsky's work, but the conflicts embodied in his technique are. So, Robert is now going to actually.
I was going to try just only reading. I haven't got a theory of the poem I'm going to read. This is the last word, the 80 flowers. And at least we'll get the book in. And I've sort of scanned and seen that it presented lots of difficulties. The book was found and we can get it in there and then get it in focus. Always upside down, so we put it in facing us, right? And now we can get. Now get it. Let's see if we get focus now.
No, not move it up.
Oh, you move it up. So if it's a focus to where I can read. Because now you're going to catch out where I'm going to, let's bring it toward us. That's what we do, bring it down a bit.
You want?
No, it's okay. Okay, so you're going to really have me out with my full problems. The form is, we're just really reading it straight on as if you were going to that page. What do we do with it at this point? We heard him refer to Bunking's English. There were words in English that he didn't know, and so forth, that were really unfamiliar, so he had great difficulty reading Bunking. Okay. The last one, I'm not taking it because it's Z, Zinnia. We catch on right away. He's got a Z, and he's arrived from A to Z. By the way, A by Z. That was the present all the time. From A, the title of the poem, to Zukofsky, the author at the end of it, from A to Z, is one of the plays in it. And this kind of play I have no difficulty with at all. I don't have a language theory for it. It's because I was about 2 years old when I took my entire delight in it, which I've never lost. It's called Building Blocks. So I don't know whether it exists as an interesting language diagram. It's simply that A and Z you caught on were really highly significant letters, and you could go around the alphabet over again because we're at Zinnia. And this one begins with a Z and ends with A, I can see right away, and I haven't even looked at it before. So this is, we go at that while we're going along because we see we're in a kind of a play. We're in a play that certainly doesn't need anything more grown up than Building Blocks to get us around. At this stage, that's exactly where we are. Zinnia, and as a matter of fact, I can see more about Zinnia the minute I see it. Wow, no wonder he wanted Zinnia. Not only because does it begin with Z and end with A, but it's a palindrome except for those two letters because it goes I-N-N-I in the middle. And everybody can see that the Z and the A are the only two significant letters, and the rest are in mirror. Zinnia. Ah, wow, what I can do on the title. I'm already exhausted. Because I've been scanning the whole book, and I begin to wonder, does he have all these flowers in his garden? I think you can hear me. I come from a very hard-growing poetry. Nothing's in the poem that ain't actually been there, and if I thought it was a mere word, I'm so much of the generation of Freud, I'm worried right away, because I'm sure something slipped in, because in my world there are no mere words. Every word leads back to something you damn well did experience, or you weren't looking around while you were on the street. And so you better connect with your life if you think you're in a land in which you can talk about it as it works. Okay, Zinnia, so it's got to be a Zinnia. But I've been through so many flowers, I'm wondering, okay, I know another thing. Zukofsky's doing a very Shakespearean thing. That period, you still recited your flowers. You still recited the garden. And at the end of his life, he recites the garden. And he has several times when he takes that delight in reciting the garden. But I get a fragrance moving through these even as I venture them. I don't get statement. I have a great trouble at a level of statement. Okay, well, let's go in. I understand. Each poem is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words long, and that's the measure all the way through. And you can use hyphenated words. Prayer plant is a word, and winter lady is a word. With prayer plant eyes, annual winter lady, zinnia miracles itself, perennial return, blessed interim strength, lengthening coreopsis summers. Well, I'll tell you another thing, is that I have absolute pleasure also at an early, infantile level. No education in linguistics or anything about discovering that winter lady is one word. God, that just set me when I was jumping up and down and could only hear it and didn't know you could find it on a page. And prayer plant. I mean, I'm all the way back to when they said about about the little girl who had a curl and when she was bad, she was horrid, and they called her unawares. My sister and I thought that was her underwears. And we said unawares for all our life and until we came to a place where a book opened, and we discovered to our amazement that they were unawares. That our underwears were unawares. See, I mean, that level, I'm not going to worry about on one hand meta-linguistics, or on the other one there's a diagram. So, prayer plant, winter lady, I understand, it's very primitive level. And coreopsis numbers, time. And, okay, maybe I'm not having all those troubles. I wanted to say something that's with prayer plant eyes, annually, winter lady, zinnia miracles itself, perennial return. Blessed, interim strength, lengthening, coreopsis summers, actually sometime, where so near, zebra fragrance, sharpened wave, current, tide, new moon to full sunrise, sunset in April ships, seaward, slow round, rosette, lancers, spears, yuccas, white knife. I thought I was going to display that this thing couldn't be read. New moon to full sunrise is as intentional as you can possibly get. If you go from new moon to full sunrise, I assume moon not only fits in there, but it's the only thing that leads us to new to full. And when we come to sometime, which is the most beautiful, by the way, physically the most beautiful book, I think, of Zukofsky is the realization of the book, Sometime. But there's been present also something also summing up the whole time of Zukofsky in another place in the poem, because the idea of perennial return, when he was talking about his work, he said, well, you have only one thing to say. He said, I mean, you find out you're always really returning and saying the same thing. You're always back on the same ground where the poem came from, life ground it came from. Zinnia miracles itself, perennial return. And with prayer and eyes were central. That Olson and Zukofsky both had eyes that couldn't see nothing. They took their glasses off, they really couldn't find anything at all. I mean, out there to see. I mean, both of them had emphysema, so the cigarettes, they're total victims of the cigarette. And both of them were markedly nearsighted, so the page was nearer than any actual zinnia. With prayer plant eyes, annually winter lady, zinnia miracles itself, perennial return. The music I can't not hear. Blessed interim, there's a blessed Celia, he does his ABCs in that. Yes, blessed Celia, happy. And so we've got what? We've got a full performance in here. In 80, we expect a full performance in 80 Flowers of the final wreath. The wreath of a life now. Now let's think of a funeral wreath. It's the wreath shape is the perennial return of flowers. It goes around into itself like zinnia goes from Z to A and back around to Z and A. And so prayer plant, look at that. You see, I can go far once because I am going on human meanings here and not on something about what words in themselves are doing, because I can see then that prayer plant has everything to do with miracles itself, perennial return. These are big life meanings.
That's what I'm missing when we talk as if it were mere language. At this stage, when it is at the very sum of a life, and it is the whole return of the funeral wreath of flowers, I am not doing monstrosity when I demonstrate that the flowers pungent throughout with the kind of utterance that Zukofsky damn well knows the poem is meant to carry, because he would not refer to Whitman otherwise. And he hoped they would do it. And he returns to Ade. He's not going to sacrifice his games to Ade. Those are the delights that he actually had. There is little. You go to his house and play with his toys. And sometimes when you're at Zukofsky's house playing with his toys, you'll wish and then he gets angry at you because you're playing with his toys. And then if you're really starting playing his games, he gets sometimes very angry, and he changes the rules and tells you can't do that. I mean, how come you came over to play on this rainy afternoon, and now you are playing the way I said we're going to play? But that's my game. That's very strong. I see this back at the same level that light's coming from, but fragrance. Okay, so I'll just read Zinnia again, because this wouldn't get big to me the minute I just meant to look at it for the first time. Zinnia with prayer plant eyes annually winter ladies. Zinnia miracles itself, perennial return. Blessed interim spring, lengthening coreopsis summer. Actual sometime where so near. Zebra fragrant, sharpened wave, currents, tide. New moon to full sun rocks. Sunset, naval ships seaward, slow round. Rosette, lancers, spear, yuccas, white.
So, do you want to show, are you going to keep talking?
No, I just read it.
Okay, shall we open discussions to whoever wants to do it? Does anybody want to lead?
I have a question.
And then,
I have a specific textual question, if I didn't answer it. And that relates to the third section of bottom of the alphabet of subjects, which is an encyclopedia or a dictionary of topics gone through, about 350 pages. And the last half of the entire alphabet, N through Z, involves only 15 pages, whereas the first half of the alphabet involves 300-odd pages. In reading that, I wonder about its function on the form. And my initial response to it is that that's a sign that here, in fact, is an unfinished work. Right here is a work that, in fact, the latter half of which did not get finished. And yet, obviously, particularly in the published format of it, right, this boxed set, has all the characteristics of the ultimately finished and handed over product. And so, like, what I've always wondered about is, like, the relation of that work to the entire idea of finishedness and closure that Zukofsky is always arguing for all of his work. I mean, he's the only...
On a long period, so his feeling of form is where he gets its closure, isn't it? I mean, you're asking for symmetry, and yet it is. There's a very simple explanation you want to have. After exhaustively doing the first half of the alphabet, you go a little more hurried for the second half. You don't exhaustively do the second half of the alphabet.
That passage you brought passages of writing a text to begin with 6 pages have 12, but I guess the inspiration came up with much pages to the poem. Maybe that passage about hydrogen right a take to begin with 6 and take it having 12 where I get the inspiration and take up as much space as the heaven home. Maybe the reverse of there. One of them did I to say playfulness.
Yeah, right.
I wonder what religious serendipity is. The found object is what I'm able to do myself, occasions, occasions teaching what I begin something and when you're moving enough to stop it,
Once that is there, carrying it out is not.
Carry yourself along for a while, just stop and try to apart that deeper.
Ron, does that make it something clear? By the time he's halfway through that alphabet, one of the things is quite clear what it would look like if it were that.
Well,
So if he so he is not just done the second half again, he simply already demonstrated what the entire thing would be.
yes, but the but in that is that one could make the same argument with a different solution in A, in that A 1 through 6 in fact will have a continual montage pattern. In fact, looks a fair amount like the Israel in Canada. And obviously, you could make the argument that he came to the same conclusion there, that the rest would be inevitable if he followed that pattern ad infinitum. So that
no, you can't make that argument because the poem shows the events that come in. The poem shows the war coming in and shattering the possibility. So it's not just that that in a mere poem he has come to a place where something was clear. That in the middle of that war he couldn't write in the same manner that he proceeded before that. And in the marriage and the household, he's not going to be writing it because they're all chained to immediate life that he's in. So that's what's hitting the form.
Right. He didn't abandon the work. He didn't abandon A. He didn't pick up a new work. He changed strategy. I don't think reading A 1 through 12, you can, for example, predict the existence of a section beginning and. That in that kind of wholesome way. So I don't think it's the same kind of situation there in the bottom. And I read it as though we're an unfinished text, published as though we're a finished text without saying that this in fact is an abandoned word.
You read bottom as an unfinished. That's possible, yeah.
No, he doesn't want to write any criticism after bottom. So,
Why I forgot there were not just 4 ways, but 24 ways. I said that about 6, maybe being helpful too. But when you put this purpose in the feedback, modify it, purpose, you get too much, feedback, you so involved with
Feedback.
if you get enough feedback, your purpose disappears.
And Larry's talking about breaking feedback that builds. and something, and that is one of the things. In 22 and 23, a tremendous feedback built. If you count 5 lines for every line, the tremendous feedback that builds up through long sections is in first place, it's quite a performance that you maintain this place at all. I mean, it's stupendous. If you read it aloud, it's like Milton. It's like the overtones of Milton because it's commanding rhetoric and imperative because the number of words are counted. But what Larry's saying here, this would be both bottom, but it would certainly be an A, as a feedback factor in a long poem that it's not, for instance, episodic like you have, but it's conceived of as having a mass and having forms like fugues present in it, and perennial return in it, that you break the feedback. So you could also by the time you're halfway through that alphabet you're imagining there, you've got to break that kind of feedback. You know very well you can't go a step further. You've got to break it in some way and clear the overtones instead of carrying it all the way through. So it isn't like a project in the sense that you're going to carry out a plan, because right away, he likes to go to a saturation point. And toward the end of A, he can go, clearly he knows his saturation point and inhabits it entirely in 22 and 23. In early places, even that early collage method was a way of breaking. While the assemblage was there, it also broke from scene to scene in order to break the feedback of things building up and becoming more than could be handled in tone. I think that's it.
You get involved so much that you lose all purpose in everything you want in the present. That's the way I
have a question for Mark. You were talking about, if I got heard you correctly, a mathematical theory of language Zukofsky has.
Well,
diagram.
Yeah, I mean, mathematics must be an approximation to nature, right? So there's a kind of use of a mathematical model by analogy, I think, in Zukofsky's poetry. When he's using figurative language, I think he also has he's also involved in the language of science and mathematics, and he's taking
the same language in this way that say Russell and Duncan conjured up to say 22. Excuse me? Do you see language then in the way that Russell and Duncan conjured it from 1910 to 1922? Is it like the words have a very direct mathematical sense?
Well, those two must use the same.
The only thing I can think about there is that there's a point where Wittgenstein says that colloquial language is almost too complicated to deal with, and Zukofsky seems to be agreeing with him. Now I don't know if that.
I was talking about the early Wittgenstein.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, I think early Wittgenstein does discuss briefly the problem of colloquial language and sort of throws it out. And Zukofsky quotes that and says that you can't, he seems to be agreeing with that, just like throwing that out of the, idiom, colloquial language. There's various ways that, slang, jargon, etc. So he doesn't look at language as a natural historian in that way, I don't think. So in a sense, there's a real focus on text, and not on common speech. I think in Zukofsky. Do you think that's fair, Robert, to say that?
Well, there would be aspects of Zukofsky, because there's also a great deal of common speech. My mind's going back to what Larry was conveying the last time he talked. He absolutely talking about feedback. Larry was talking about how you're overwhelmed when language is self-engrossed, when it's engrossed in itself. And it explains why we refresh language when we return to the ground of experience. Why, when there's a circuit between life experience and our bodies and so forth and language, our own human feelings and language is refreshed. And Larry's sense is one that I also have, because I think for all Zukofsky has great playfulness, and when you look at an area of playing Zukofsky, you can find these places of playfulness, but he's become entirely self-engrossed in the language there, and so you go on for quite a long time, and you realize you are in a feedback system. You are in this kind of, and it is destructive of the act, so the language rapidly loses energy. The actual energy we feel in language is the one of our own energy of response, and this calling up upon our energy. So this operation call upon our energy. But if it's feeding on its own, it exhausts us. So we find the language eating itself up. I'm not a philosopher, so I experience it physiologically. It's eating itself up when you're reading.
Right. Well, there's something about locating one's own language at a particular time and drawing the limits around that language. I think that Zukofsky does that. I don't think there's anything in his interest, say in dialect or idiolect. You know, I don't think there are very few places where he's cueing on that kind. Only in a very literary sense, like you might say the book of songs is like black dialect or something like that. In the 30s, I think there are a couple of uses of material like that. But otherwise, there's a limit that Zukofsky is very much contained by in terms of American actual spoken language, and so that I think, like for instance, Little for Koreanagers, I think there's a real hostility to certain subsequent developments in culture and language there.
Well, I'd say one thing about American speech. Zukofsky is not that straining toward having American speech. Our art bless Celia, I guess it's when we do the ABCs on it, isn't it? Art bless Celia. And that, for instance, is actually goes back to Handel's cantata concept. I mean, it's in English. It's a foreigner coming into English at that point too, and so we're not concerned about American speech, but it's brought into American speech, so we hear it again. And after all, it couldn't possibly have its charge if there weren't the emotion, ardent Celia. It's not language separated from very powerful feeling and from our knowledge and his knowledge, and the poem's knowledge, because he makes it absolute in the last part, that he's talking about the very center of ardent blessed Celia, who will be so much the center that at the end she is the one who composes the close of the poem. Now, gee, if we don't restore the human meanings, yes, indeed, we just have an ABC, and it looks as if he had Wittgenstein in his head, but Wittgenstein only comes into that head because it's part of that family's interior orders and way of setting the table. All her education and so forth.
for that much getting more human in TSA with a hard man.
Hard man. I got to get that quote all the way back. T.S. Eliot was a hard man.
Hard problem with Jeremiah is not that
Yeah, I think we could go on forever, and we're at 11 o'clock or so.
Yeah, so,